Superstar is about to sign a Nike endorsement deal worth $28 million.
He pisses me off when people are like, she's not the face of the league.
Who would be?
What?
The room was set up perfectly, every detail accounted for. Attorneys lined the back wall with their briefcases open and their pens uncapped. Nike executives stood near the stage with the kind of quiet, practiced confidence that comes from having done this exact thing dozens of times before. Cameras were locked into pre-planned positions. A custom jersey, gold stitching, Indiana Fever colors, her name across the back, sat waiting under warm stage lighting like the centerpiece of a ceremony that had already been written, rehearsed, and timed down to the minute. $25 million, a signature Nike shoe deal. The kind of contract that makes grown men in the NBA stop mid-conversation and do the math twice. And the woman at the center of all of it, Caitlyn Clark, hadn't even finished her first professional season yet. Everyone in that building knew how the next 2 hours were supposed to go. The executives knew it. The media knew it. The photographers had their fingers hovering over the shutter buttons, waiting for the shot they'd already mentally framed. What none of them knew was what Caitlyn Clark was actually about to do. Because she didn't follow the script, and what happened next changed everything. To understand why that night mattered as much as it did, you first have to understand the world that Caitlyn Clark walked into when she entered the WNBA. Because without that backdrop, the magnitude of what she did with her leverage doesn't fully hit. And this part of the story, the part that most casual fans have never looked at directly, is the part that should make you feel something uncomfortable. Not outrage for the sake of it. Just honest, clear-eyed discomfort at a reality that sat in plain sight for nearly 3 decades, while most of America looked the other way. The WNBA has existed since 1997. 27 years of professional women's basketball in the United States. Championships won, dynasties built, players who were genuinely among the most gifted athletes on the planet operating at the highest level of their sport. And for the overwhelming majority of those 27 years, the financial reality for the women playing in that league was, to say it plainly, a national embarrassment. Veteran players, women who had dedicated 10, 12, 15 years of their lives to the game, were earning salaries in the mid-5-figure range. Let that sit for a moment. A player who had spent over a decade refining her craft, sacrificing her body through a brutal professional schedule, and competing at the absolute peak of her sport in America, was bringing home somewhere between $50,000 and $70,000 per year from her basketball contract. In cities like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, where many of these teams were based, that number didn't make someone wealthy. In many cases, it didn't even make someone comfortable. It barely covered rent. The maximum salary in the WNBA, the absolute ceiling for the best player on the best contract in the entire league, sat at approximately $250,000 annually. By most American standards, that sounds like a meaningful income. But place it next to the NBA, where the minimum rookie contract, the absolute floor for an unproven player on a 10-day deal, exceeds $1 million per year, and the picture becomes something much harder to rationalize. The gap between those two numbers isn't just a pay disparity. It's a structural statement about whose athletic labor was considered worth investing in and whose wasn't. The consequences of that ceiling weren't abstract. They showed up in real people's real lives in ways that occasionally broke through into public conversation, even if the sports media didn't always treat them with the weight they deserved. Angel Reese, one of the most recognizable and marketable young players in the league, stated publicly that her WNBA salary was not enough to cover her rent. Not as a metaphor, not as a general complaint about wages. As a specific, concrete, factual description of her financial situation as a professional athlete competing at the highest level of her sport in the United States of America. So what did these women do with that reality? They adapted. The way women in this situation have always adapted, by figuring out how to make the math work even when the system wasn't designed to help them. During the WNBA offseason, which runs from roughly October through April, players boarded planes. They flew to Europe, to Australia, to Russia, to China, to Turkey, anywhere that would pay them a wage that actually reflected what they were worth on a basketball court. They spent months separated from their families, their communities, and their lives at home, playing in foreign leagues just to sustain careers that the American market was dramatically undervaluing. And back home, endorsement deals were barely a conversation for most of these women. Signature sneakers were essentially a myth. In a league that had been operating for nearly 3 decades, the list of WNBA players who had ever received their own signature shoe could be counted on one hand with fingers left over. Sheryl Swoopes in 1995, actually before the league officially launched. Elena Del Don, Maya Moore, Candace Parker. Sabrina Ionescu in 2023. That's the complete list. Across 27 years of professional women's basketball, fewer women have had signature shoes than most NBA teams have players on their active roster at any given moment. The women playing in that league were, in many cases, wearing footwear branded with someone else's name, earning nothing from the companies simultaneously profiting from those products. The most visible faces of women's professional basketball in America were functionally invisible to the marketing infrastructure that surrounded them. The machine was running. It just wasn't cutting them in. That was the table when Caitlyn Clark arrived in the spring of 2024. That was the financial architecture she stepped into as the first overall pick in the WNBA draft. That was the system, built over nearly 3 decades, that she was walking into as a 22-year-old rookie from Iowa who had never played a single professional minute. And within months of lacing up for the first time in an Indiana Fever uniform, that architecture started cracking in ways nobody had anticipated. The question was what she was going to do when the money finally came. And the answer to that question is what nobody in that room saw coming. The 2024 WNBA draft was watched by 2.45 million people. The previous viewership record for the draft was approximately 600,000. Caitlyn Clark had not played a professional minute, had not attended a single team practice, had not taken one shot in an Indiana Fever uniform, and she had already quadrupled the audience for the draft itself, the administrative announcement of where she would be playing, not even an actual game. That number was a signal. Anyone paying attention to the sports business world understood exactly what it meant. This wasn't a popular athlete generating buzz in her familiar environment. This was someone whose name alone, attached to an event that had previously drawn the kind of viewership you'd expect from a late-night cable rerun, was fundamentally altering the scale of interest in women's professional basketball in real time. The Indiana Fever selected her first overall, and from the moment the commissioner called her name, the metrics began moving in ways the league had never experienced. Season ticket sales for the Fever didn't just increase. They surged by more than 1,000% compared to the prior year. Read that number again because it's worth sitting with, not double, not triple, more than 10 times the previous year's sales. Road games in cities where WNBA franchises had never sold out a single game in their entire history began selling out weeks before tip-off. Television ratings for games featuring Caitlyn Clark didn't inch upward. They multiplied, in some cases doubling or tripling the viewership, numbers that those time slots had historically produced. Merchandise told the same story. Jerseys bearing her number moved faster than the league's supply chain could keep up with. The WNBA's merchandising operation, which had never faced this particular problem before, was caught genuinely flat-footed by the velocity of demand. And beyond the numbers, she was pulling in a demographic that women's professional basketball had tried and failed to capture at scale for years. Young women and girls who had never watched a WNBA game in their lives, families bringing their daughters to their first professional basketball experience. A generation of new fans who had found their way to the sport, specifically because of one player. Nike watched every data point of this unfold in real time. They are among the most sophisticated brand operators in the world, and they are exceptionally good at identifying the difference between a trend and a transformation. What they were watching wasn't a spike in interest that would fade when the novelty wore off. It was a structural shift in the market for women's sports, the kind that creates permanent new audience segments and opens commercial doors that don't close again afterward. And Caitlyn Clark was sitting directly at the center of it. The deal that emerged from negotiations was reported at somewhere between $25 and $28 million over 8 years. The most widely circulated figure landed at $25 million. To truly understand what that number meant, you need a point of comparison. Sabrina Ionescu's Nike deal, which had been the largest endorsement contract in WNBA history at the time it was signed, was a multi-year agreement reported in the seven-figure range. Caitlyn Clark's deal didn't edge past it. It didn't surpass it by a comfortable margin. The distance between the two contracts was large enough that seasoned NBA players, men competing in a league with an average annual salary exceeding $10 million, were doing double takes and asking how a rookie in the women's league had outpaced their own endorsement numbers. Let's be clear about something important here, because this point matters. Nike was not being generous. Generosity is not a factor in 8-figure endorsement negotiations. This was a business calculation, precise, data-driven, and entirely rational given the evidence sitting in front of them. They weren't signing Caitlyn Clark because she could drain a 35-foot pull-up three-pointer, though she absolutely can and does. They were signing her because of what happened to the business metrics every time her name was attached to something. Arenas sold out, ratings climbed, merchandise moved, new audiences arrived and, crucially, stayed. She hadn't just become the most marketable rookie in the history of women's basketball. She had become, in the eyes of Nike's marketing division, the commercial face of the entire trajectory of women's sports in America. That's a different category of value, and it commanded a different category of contract. But here is the part that none of the financial analysis and none of the viewership data could have predicted. Here is the variable that no one in the negotiating room had accounted for. Because Caitlyn Clark didn't just sit across that table and negotiate the best possible deal for herself. She sat across that table, looked at the executives who needed her signature more than she needed their approval, and told them that the contract she was signing was going to include someone else. The executives paused, the attorneys looked up from their documents, the room shifted. She didn't blink, she didn't hedge. She laid out exactly what she wanted and made it clear that her name wasn't going on anything until that condition was met. Nike said yes. And the story of why she made that demand, the story of what had been happening on the court all season long that led her to that table with that specific request, is where this entire thing becomes something much more than a business announcement. These kinds of launches don't leave room for improvisation. That's the first thing you need to understand about what was supposed to happen that evening. When Nike executes a signature athlete reveal at this level, with this much financial weight and this much media attention attached to it, the entire event is engineered to within an inch of its life. Every element accounted for. Every contingency planned around. Every camera angle decided before the first guest walks through the door. There was a printed schedule with timestamps. A guest list that had been reviewed and approved. Index cards with speech talking points sitting backstage, lightly pre-written to sound spontaneous while actually being anything but. Pre-positioned cameras at angles that had been scouted and approved by Nike's visual team in advance. A custom jersey, gold stitching, Indiana Fever colors, Caitlyn's name and number rendered with the kind of craftsmanship that communicates this is a significant moment. Sitting under warm stage lighting waiting for its reveal. Nike had done versions of this event dozens of times. They had a blueprint. The blueprint worked. There was no reason to deviate from it, and no one in that building expected anyone to try. The structure was clean and logical. Step 1, a highlight film. Not a generic one, a carefully produced, emotionally calibrated short film tracing Caitlyn's journey from the gymnasiums of Des Moines, Iowa, through the record books of the University of Iowa to the courts of the WNBA. The kind of film that reminds you why you're in the room. Step 2. A Nike executive walks onto the stage with the gold jersey in hand. The presentation moment. The visual centerpiece. Step 3. Caitlyn accepts the jersey, delivers a few lines that have been lightly refined by the communications team to sound natural while hitting the key brand messaging, and smiles into the lights. Step 4. A sustained photo opportunity, 1,000 images captured. The internet fed exactly what it needs for 48 hours of sustained engagement. Step 5. Everyone goes home satisfied, the pre-order links go live, and the machine continues operating at full speed. Standard, controlled, replicable. The kind of event that generates precisely the content it was designed to generate and nothing beyond that. Nike had run versions of this playbook with Michael Jordan, with LeBron James, with Kobe Bryant, with Serena Williams. The names change. The cultural context shifts. The fundamental structure remains the same because it works. Caitlyn arrived at the venue with the kind of presence that people who encounter her for the first time consistently find surprising. She was 22 years old, technically still a rookie, still in the process of adjusting her body to the physical demands of the professional game, still learning the tendencies of her teammates, still absorbing the specific texture of what it means to carry an entire league's viewership on your shoulders every time you lace up. None of that showed in how she moved through the room. She was composed in the way that only people who have been performing under enormous pressure since adolescence can be composed. Not the performed calm of someone pretending they aren't nervous, but the genuine stillness of someone who has been in high-stakes environments long enough that they stopped registering as threatening. If you've watched her during pre-game warm-ups, moving through her shooting routine with total focus while the arena fills and the cameras find her, you know exactly what that presence looks like. It doesn't waver based on the size of the crowd or the importance of the moment. It's consistent because it's real. Standing beside her as she moved through the room was Sophie Cunningham, her teammate, her Indiana Fever colleague, the person who had been next to her through the entire grinding, physically punishing, emotionally complicated experience of Caitlyn's first WNBA season. As far as Sophie understood it, she was there as support. A familiar face in a room full of strangers and cameras and professional formality. Maybe she'd appear in a few background photographs that would end up on someone's Instagram story. Maybe Caitlyn would mention her name during the speech, a brief acknowledgement, a moment of public appreciation, the kind of thing that feels meaningful in the room and then fades from memory within the week. Maybe she'd get a glass of something sparkling and a seat near the front and spend the evening watching her teammate receive a well-deserved honor. She had no idea, and crucially, neither did anyone else in that building. The lights went down. The ambient conversation in the room faded, then dropped entirely into silence. On the large screen mounted behind the stage, the highlight film began. And in the audience, every phone came down. Every side conversation stopped. Because what was playing on that screen wasn't what anyone had expected. It wasn't a polished, comfortable celebration of everything that had gone right. It was something more honest than that. Something rawer. Something that looked directly at the parts of Caitlyn Clark's rookie season that most brands would have quietly left on the cutting room floor. And by the time it ended, the room was leaning forward, every person in it waiting for what came next. What came next was something none of them had on their schedules. The film that played that evening wasn't a standard sports package. It wasn't the kind of bright, triumphant montage that typically accompanies these announcements. All slow-motion buzzer beaters and swelling orchestral music and carefully selected moments of joy. What Nike had produced, and what now played across that large screen in front of every camera and every journalist and every executive in the room, was something considerably more honest than that. It started at the beginning. A young girl in Iowa, in gymnasiums that were only partially filled, already operating at a level that the local camera operators were visibly struggling to keep up with. Making shots from distances that looked almost unreasonable on a body that young. Drawing crowds that even then were exceeding what the venues had seen before. Local parents in the bleachers who probably didn't fully understand yet what they were watching, but understood enough to keep coming back. It moved through her time at the University of Iowa with deliberate pacing. The escalating crowds, the escalating numbers. The all-time college basketball scoring record that had stood since Pete Maravich set it in 1970, falling to a 21-year-old from Iowa who didn't seem to think it was particularly remarkable. The 2023 NCAA Women's Championship game between Iowa and LSU that drew 9.9 million viewers and became the most-watched women's college basketball game in American history. Caitlyn Clark on the court that night, performing under pressure in front of an audience that no women's college basketball game had ever come close to reaching. And then the film arrived at the WNBA. and it did not look away from what it found there. It showed the fouls that the officials decided not to call. The hard contact that crossed the line between competitive basketball and something more deliberate. The elbows landing in places they shouldn't. The screens set with an extra dimension of force and intent. The moments where the whistle should have sounded and didn't, for reasons that the film didn't attempt to explain, but presented clearly enough that the audience could draw its own conclusions. It showed the media commentary. The pundits declaring she was overexposed before she had completed a month of professional play. The takes arguing she was undeserving of the attention she was receiving, that the interest surrounding her was manufactured, that the market was overcorrecting. The relentless online commentary from people who seemed to have a specific and personal investment in her failing, targeting her not for anything she had done wrong, but for the simple fact of existing in a spotlight they had decided she hadn't earned. It showed the exhaustion, the reality of being a rookie in a physical league while simultaneously being the face of a media moment that was generating more coverage than the rest of the league combined. The late flights between cities. The mornings after hard losses when the cameras were already waiting outside the arena before the team bus had finished unloading. The weight of carrying expectations that no first-year player should reasonably have to carry while simultaneously learning how to execute within a professional system for the very first time. But then the film pivoted, and it showed the other side of all of that with equal honesty. Buzzer beaters that physically lifted arenas. The roar of sold-out crowds in cities where WNBA games had never sold out before, crowds that wrapped around city blocks, that arrived hours before tip-off, that created an atmosphere that the league had spent 27 years trying to generate and had finally found. Little girls in the stands wearing her jersey, watching with expressions of pure, unfiltered awe that no marketing team could manufacture or replicate. The kind of image that makes you understand, viscerally, why any of this matters beyond the numbers. The film ended. The screen went dark. The room leaned forward in collective anticipation. A Nike executive walked out from the wings, gold-stitched jersey in hand. Phones came up across the entire room simultaneously. This was the moment everyone had shown up for. This was the photograph. The image that would represent the announcement across every platform within the hour. Caitlyn stepped forward and accepted the jersey. She held it with both hands and looked at it. And then, for just a half-second longer than anyone in the room had anticipated, she paused. It was a small pause, barely perceptible. But in a room where every element had been choreographed and every beat had been planned, a half-second of unscripted stillness registers. She turned, away from the executive who had just handed her the jersey, away from the photographers whose cameras were raised and ready, away from the Nike branding and the stage lighting and the entire carefully constructed ceremony that had been built around this specific moment. She turned to face Sophie Cunningham. Her voice was steady, not performative, not amplified for the room, just clear and direct and carrying a weight that the people closest to her said they felt physically. This is not just for me. This is for all the women who show up, fight hard, and protect their team. No applause, no cheering, no cameras clicking. The room froze, not in confusion exactly, but in the specific suspension that happens when people sense that something real is occurring and don't want to interrupt it before they understand what it is. And Caitlyn Clark was far from finished. A sleek black display case rolled out from behind the curtain. The audience watched it with the uncertain attention of people who had abandoned their original expectations and were now genuinely unsure what was happening. Caitlyn reached into the case and removed a custom shoebox. She didn't hold it toward the cameras. She didn't position it for the photographers still waiting with their lenses pointed at the stage. She walked it directly to Sophie Cunningham and placed it in her hands. Sophie smiled, the particular smile of someone who believes they are about to receive a thoughtful, personal gift, a commemorative gesture, a pair of team-colored sneakers to mark her teammates' big night, something she would keep and remember. She opened the box. Inside, custom player-only sneakers, hand-stitched in full Indiana Fever colors, with 3 words running across the side panel in precise embroidery. Never give up. Sophie ran her fingers across the stitching, looked at the shoes. and then reached beneath the tissue paper and found something else entirely. A folded document, formal, legal, not a note, not a letter, not a personal message. A contract, her contract. A complete, standalone Nike endorsement deal negotiated specifically for Sophie Cunningham, secured by Caitlyn Clark as a condition of her own signing, delivered in a shoe box, in front of every camera in the room, on the most significant night of Caitlyn's professional career so far. The room took approximately 3 full seconds to process what it had just witnessed, and then it understood. And the silence ended, not with the practiced, polite applause of a corporate event, but with the kind of eruption that happens when a room full of people realize simultaneously that they have just watched something that doesn't have a category yet. If you've been watching Indiana Fever basketball closely this season, not just the highlights, not just the Caitlyn Clark moments that made it onto national broadcasts, but the actual games, the physical texture of what it looked like night after night on that court, then you already know the answer to the question everyone was asking after the Nike event. Why Sophie? Out of every player on the Indiana Fever roster, out of every teammate and colleague and person in Caitlyn Clark's professional orbit, why did Sophie Cunningham receive the contract, the custom sneakers, and the most significant public acknowledgement of her career? Because Sophie Cunningham spent the entire season doing something that nobody was covering, nobody was rewarding, and nobody in the broader sports conversation was paying any attention to. She spent the season making sure Caitlyn Clark survived it. That's not a dramatic overstatement. That's a description of what was happening on the court from essentially the first week of the season. From the moment Caitlyn Clark suited up for her first WNBA game, she had a target on her that went beyond the ordinary pressure of being a high-profile draft pick adjusting to professional competition. It was something more specific and more persistent than that. The kind of target that forms around someone who has arrived in a space and immediately, unavoidably, irrevocably changed it. And not everyone in that space was entirely comfortable with the speed or the scale of the change. She was being fouled harder than anyone else on the floor, not at the level that physical, competitive basketball naturally produces, at a level that had an extra dimension of intent to it, elbows finding her at angles that the rulebook doesn't cover, screens being set against her with force that exceeded what the play required, contact occurring earlier higher, and with a frequency that the officiating crew was, to put it diplomatically, not consistently calling at the rate that the rulebook suggested they should. Chennedy Carter's hard foul, the one that landed on Caitlyn during an early season game and spread across national sports media within hours, became the most visible symbol of a pattern that had been building since the opening tip. It generated debate about officiating standards, about player safety, about what the league owed its most commercially valuable player, and about whether the physical treatment Clark was receiving reflected something more systemic than competitive basketball tends to produce. The conversation was heated, it was divisive, and it continued well beyond the news cycle that typically absorbs these moments. But what that conversation largely missed, what wasn't making the highlight packages or the sports talk segments, was what was happening on the other side of the ball. What Sophie Cunningham was doing, quietly and without expectation of recognition, every single night. She wasn't lobbying for endorsement opportunities, wasn't engineering moments for her own highlight reel, wasn't performing for the cameras that were always pointed slightly away from her because they were pointed at Caitlyn. She was doing the bone-deep, unglamorous, stat-sheet invisible work that keeps a team intact when the environment around it is working hard to pull it apart. She put her body into hard fouls. Deliberate ones, delivered with the specific intent of communicating something to the rest of the league in a language that every player on every court understands without anyone having to say it aloud. The message was simple and consistent. Cheap shots on her teammate come with a cost. You want to take a run at Caitlyn Clark, physically or otherwise, you are going to have to calculate what it costs you to deal with Sophie Cunningham directly afterward. That calculation changed behavior. It may not have eliminated the targeting entirely, but it introduced a consequence where one hadn't existed before. Late in the season, during a stretch where an opposing team appeared to be making a coordinated effort to make things physically difficult for Clark, Sophie committed a foul that was impossible to misread. No ambiguity. No gray area, a clear and deliberate statement. When asked about it on camera afterward, she didn't hedge, didn't soften her answer, and didn't offer anything resembling an apology. She said she would do it again. And she said it with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who meant exactly what they said. None of this was performance. There were no ESPN segments celebrating what she was doing. No trending moments on social media. No brands reaching out because she threw herself in front of a hard foul to protect her rookie teammate. She had been this kind of player her entire career, back through her years at the University of Missouri, through her time with the Phoenix Mercury before the trade to Indiana brought her to Caitlyn's side. She didn't become a fierce, protective teammate because the cameras arrived. She had always been that. The cameras just weren't watching that part. Caitlyn Clark was watching. She watched every moment, filed it away without making a public statement about it, because public statements of gratitude weren't what the moment called for and weren't consistent with how she operates. She took quiet, precise inventory over the course of an entire season. And then she walked into the biggest financial negotiation of her career and used every ounce of what she had earned to make sure the inventory got settled. When she said off script, in front of every camera in the room, that people talk about the plays Sophie makes, but Sophie makes the plays nobody sees, she wasn't delivering a rehearsed line. She was delivering a verdict. Specific, honest, earned, and completely true. In the days following that evening in Indianapolis, the footage moved across the internet in the particular way that genuinely unscripted moments do. Not because a distribution team pushed it at the right time, not because an algorithm had been fed the correct variables, but because people who watched it immediately understood they were looking at something that didn't fit neatly into any existing category and felt compelled to share it with someone else. The social media numbers were significant. But what mattered more to Nike than the engagement metrics was a question their marketing leadership had to answer within roughly 48 hours of the event concluding. They had two options in front of them, and they had to choose one. Option 1, treat the Sophie moment as a powerful but contained sidebar to the main story. Let it generate its cycle of warm, appreciative social media attention, allow the sports media to write the feel-good pieces for a few days, and then return to the campaign architecture that had already been designed, approved, and scheduled for rollout. One athlete, one signature shoe, one carefully crafted narrative built around individual excellence. The playbook they had used dozens of times before with athletes across the full spectrum of global sports. Option 2, recognize what had actually happened on that stage and restructure everything around it. To understand why the decision wasn't straightforward, you need to understand Nike's position in the market at that specific moment. The women's sports economy had been expanding at a rate that was outpacing almost every projection the sports business world had made about it. And Nike had been watching that expansion with the close attention of a company that does not like to be on the wrong side of a cultural shift. The 2023 NCAA Women's Championship game between Iowa and LSU had drawn 9.9 million viewers, making it the most-watched women's college basketball game in American history, with Caitlyn Clark's presence widely credited as a central driver of that audience. By the time she entered the WNBA draft, Indiana Fever season ticket sales had already surged by over 1,000%. Road games in markets that had never produced a WNBA sellout were selling out. A new audience, specifically the young female demographic that sports marketing had been trying and largely failing to reach at scale for years, was arriving in numbers that the industry hadn't anticipated. Nike had signed Caitlyn Clark because she was the clearest commercial expression of all of that momentum. She was the face of a transformation that was already happening, a transformation that would continue with or without her, but was happening faster and more dramatically with her at the center of it. What her team's marketing division was now staring at, in the footage from that Indianapolis stage, was something that no advertising budget on the planet could have manufactured. They had spent decades and enormous resources trying to find authentic stories, genuinely human, genuinely earned, genuinely unscripted narratives, to anchor their campaigns around, because they understood better than most that audiences in the current media environment are exceptionally good at detecting the difference between something real and something constructed to appear real. What had just happened on that stage was about as unmanufacturable as a story gets. It had occurred in front of their own cameras, at their own event, produced by a 22-year-old who had not consulted a single communications professional before doing it. The question was whether they were willing to let go of the campaign they had already built and replace it with this. They were. Nike restructured their entire Caitlyn Clark campaign rollout in a matter of days. The individual athlete, single signature shoe framework that had been the foundation of the original plan was replaced by something fundamentally different. The new central narrative wasn't about one player's individual excellence. It was about partnership, the relationship between two people who had been through something genuinely difficult together, and what that relationship produced in terms of loyalty, protection, and the kind of trust that forms in unglamorous circumstances and holds under pressure. Consider what Nike had historically built its most iconic campaigns around. The original Air Jordan mythology was constructed entirely on the premise of individual supremacy, one player, alone against the world, defined by his willingness to take the last shot and his refusal to share the burden of losing. The Kobe Bryant era pushed that premise even further into isolation, greatness as a fundamentally solitary pursuit, excellence achieved by outworking everyone else in the building in the hours when no one else was watching. These were powerful narratives. They worked commercially for decades, but they were built on a specific vision of athletic greatness that treated other people primarily as obstacles or context. What had just happened between Caitlyn Clark and Sophie Cunningham couldn't live in that framework. It was built on the opposite premise. It was about what forms between people, in the spaces between games, in the difficult moments that cameras typically miss, in the specific kind of loyalty that can only develop when someone has consistently shown up for you when showing up cost them something. Nike produced short documentary-style content using real footage from fever practices and road games. The quiet moments that broadcast cameras typically ignore. Sophie positioning herself between Caitlyn and hostile crowd energy during away games. The two of them in conversation on the team bus after a hard loss, genuine and unguarded in the way people are when they aren't performing for anyone. Late nights in an empty practice facility, working on pick-and-roll combinations long after the rest of the team had gone home. Just the two of them, the ball and the work. The co-branded merchandise dropped and sold out within hours. Not days, hours. The story, as it turned out, sold itself because it was real, and audiences can tell. The sneakers will eventually go out of production. The merchandise will cycle through. The social media moment will settle into the archive of things that were significant when they happened and are referenced periodically afterward. That's the natural rhythm of these things, and there's no reason to pretend that what happened in Indianapolis was somehow exempt from it. But there are aspects of what happened that evening that aren't going away. And they operate at a level that goes beyond Caitlyn Clark and Sophie Cunningham, beyond Nike, and beyond even the WNBA's ongoing and accelerating financial transformation. Start with the most concrete and immediate impact. What Caitlyn Clark demonstrated in that negotiating room, by making her own signing conditional on a deal for her teammate, was that athlete leverage in women's sports can be used as a structural tool. Not just to maximize individual compensation, which is the traditional and entirely rational use of leverage in professional athletics, but to actively expand who else gets access to the table. She had accumulated, through her own extraordinary market value, a degree of negotiating power that gave her genuine options about how to deploy it. She chose to deploy it in a way that created an opportunity for someone who would not otherwise have had access to that specific room at that specific level. That's not a small thing. It's not a gesture. It's a demonstration, visible, documented, and now sitting in the institutional memory of the sports business world, that a player with sufficient market value can use endorsement negotiations to expand the financial footprint of women's sports in ways that go beyond their own contract. Whether other athletes in other negotiations begin to see that possibility and act on it is an open question. But the possibility has now been demonstrated publicly, which is different from it merely being theoretically available. Zoom out slightly to the broader picture of the WNBA's financial trajectory, because that context is essential for understanding the weight of this moment. The league has been navigating a period of rapid, unprecedented change since Caitlyn Clark's arrival in the spring of 2024. Viewership numbers that the league had never previously approached are now being treated as a new baseline to build from rather than a ceiling to aspire to. Merchandise revenue is operating in a different order of magnitude than it was 2 years ago. Expansion franchises are generating interest and investment that would have been unimaginable in the league's previous financial reality. The collective bargaining conversation is shifting, with players now negotiating from a position of demonstrated market value that simply didn't exist at the same scale before. All of that was already in motion. Caitlyn Clark didn't cause it entirely on her own, and it would be reductive to credit or burden one person with a shift of that scale. But she accelerated it, dramatically and measurably. And the Nike moment, specifically the Sophie Cunningham element of it, added a dimension to the conversation that pure financial metrics don't capture. Because what the Sophie moment communicated, beyond the specific dollar amounts and the contract language and the merchandise numbers, was something about what kind of culture this era of women's basketball is capable of building. The WNBA has always had extraordinary athletes. It has had fierce competitors, genuine icons, players who would have been superstars in any era and any sport. What it has sometimes lacked is the broad cultural infrastructure. The media attention, the commercial investment, the public conversation. That allows those athletes to be seen at the scale their talent warrants. The inflection point that Caitlyn Clark's arrival represented is, in part, a moment where that infrastructure finally began to catch up. And the question that sits inside that moment, the question that the Sophie Cunningham story forces into the open, is what kind of culture gets built inside that infrastructure as it expands. Whether the financial growth of women's sports produces a competitive environment where players are fighting each other for diminishing individual pieces of a growing pie, or whether it produces something more collaborative, more oriented toward collective advancement. That question doesn't have a predetermined answer. What happened on that stage in Indianapolis was one answer. One player, at the peak of her leverage, choosing to use it in a way that expanded access rather than consolidating it. That's a data point. It's a visible, public, commercially documented data point about what's possible when someone with power chooses to use it differently than convention expects. Sophie Cunningham spent an entire season doing work that nobody was watching, absorbing contact, making herself available as a barrier between her teammate and whatever was coming, sending messages through hard fouls that she knew wouldn't make anyone's highlight reel, but would be received clearly by the people who needed to receive them. She did it without expectation, without a contract waiting at the end of it, without any reasonable basis for believing that the world was going to take notice. Caitlyn Clark noticed, and then she made sure everyone else did too. The plays that nobody sees are still plays. The labor that doesn't appear on the stat sheet is still labor. The loyalty that operates in the background, in the unglamorous spaces, in the moments when the cameras are pointed somewhere else, it's still loyalty. It still costs something. It still matters. What changed on that night in Indianapolis is that it was acknowledged. Formally, publicly, and in a language, a signed contract, a custom shoe, a seat at a table that previously had one chair that the sports business world understands without needing translation. Here's the thing about moments that actually change something. They rarely announce themselves clearly while they're happening. You usually only recognize them in hindsight when enough time has passed to see what shifted and what didn't. But occasionally, rarely, and only when the circumstances align in exactly the right way, you get to watch one unfold in real time. You get to be in the room, or watching the room, when someone makes a choice that doesn't follow the expected script and the entire environment around them has to recalibrate. That was Indianapolis. That was a 22-year-old rookie, at the most powerful moment of her professional career so far, choosing to use what she had earned to pull someone else forward. Not symbolically. Not with a speech and a toast and a photograph. With a contract. With a real business decision that cost her real negotiating capital and produced a real, tangible outcome for someone who had earned it and would never have gotten it any other way. The athletes who move the culture forward aren't always the ones who score the most. Sometimes they're the ones who, when they finally get to the table, make sure they don't sit down alone. Sophie Cunningham made the plays nobody saw. Now everybody sees them. And that changes what's possible for every player who comes after her.